Thank you. Doesn't matter how many times I do that, it still feels very powerful to like hear silence when you say hello. Anyways, thanks everyone for being here. I'm really excited about our next speaker, Caren Walker, who's an associate professor at the University of California, San Diego, in the psychology department. Although it's also the co-director, I think, of the, no, you don't call it certificate, specialization in cognitive science, which I think is very similar to our certificate program in cognitive science. Caren is in the psychology department now, but comes to us through philosophy/psychology at various stages. So she did a bachelor's in philosophy and psychology, and then a master's in philosophy of science, and then also psychology before doing her PhD at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And I'm particularly excited for this talk. I first emailed Caren when I was a postdoc because I was really excited about watching a talk she gave on Zoom during the COVID era. And I emailed her immediately and was like, oh my God, I love all of these ideas. I think I said it more professionally than that, but like that's what was in my head. And then I phrased a more professional version of that. And so I'm really excited now to see a talk in person instead of over Zoom and hear what she has to say. So join me in welcoming Caren.
Thank you, Michelle, for inviting me. I remember that email very well, actually. It was enthusiastic, but everyone likes to be contacted right after a talk with enthusiasm, right? It means that it went well. So I encourage you all to email me directly immediately after this talk. Okay. So it's really fun to be here. This is my first time at Rutgers, although I grew up in the Northeast. So I should be used to the freezing cold, but I'm not because I've become soft in San Diego, but it's still very nice. It's very nice to visit. Okay, so the talk I'm going to give you today is called What Shapes the Space of Possibilities That Children Consider. And I'm starting from the idea that early learning, if you spent any time with little kids, can seem kind of miraculous at times, right? From just a handful of observations, very young children can make predictions, they can generate informative actions in the world, and they can infer the existence of variables that they've never seen before from evidence that they observe. And the question that motivates all of my research, but really the project of cognitive development more broadly, is how are we able to do this, right? How are we able to acquire these abstract, structured, causal representations of the world so quickly and so accurately, given the relatively impoverished information that we're getting from our senses? So to answer this question, I take an interdisciplinary approach to development. So I combine perspectives from psychology and philosophy with perspectives in education and cultural and computational theory to examine how it is that features of the learning context impose unique top-down constraints on children's use of abstract representations in early life. And my particular focus is on children's ability to engage in a form of scientific thinking or their reasoning about cause and effect, or the causal world, in light of some amount of uncertainty. So it's been proposed that children are implicitly formulating hypotheses about the world, just like little scientists do, and then they're testing and rationally revising those hypotheses in light of evidence that they observe. And in my lab, we've been thinking about some of the processes by which some of those hypotheses are privileged over others, or to put it another way, what shapes the space of possibilities that children consider. So today I'm going to approach this pretty broad question in the context of three smaller ones, like we tend to do in these academic talks. So the first one is just to ask what possibilities are even available to the youngest learners, and in particular, do these include abstract or higher order kinds of relational concepts? Second, I'll ask what type of input constrains the possibilities that children consider, and here I'm going to focus on features of the learning environment. And then finally, I'll pivot to pretty briefly highlight several new lines of work that consider what children do when they're confronted with multiple possibilities when they have to negotiate those. So first, what types of possibilities are available, and do these include abstract relational concepts? I should say I'm a very informal person, so if you have questions, clarification questions, just raise your hand. I'm happy to pause and answer them. And I'll also pause after each section so that you guys can ask more substantive questions. Okay, so conventional wisdom, right, suggests that abstract thinking progresses slowly and linearly, moving from the concrete towards the abstract in this bottom-up emergent process. We know from Jenny's work, where is Jenny? Oh, there you are. You're all the way over there. Right, that we're intuitive empiricists. So this kind of a model is really, really intuitive to us. But, right, it doesn't actually capture what it is that we know that children do, right? So because for the type of rapid learning that children undergo in early childhood, their inferences really must be constrained by more abstract concepts that are going to constrain the information that's coming in and make it more interpretable. So to illustrate this, I really like this. This is an intuitive example for you. Let's say this child heads into the kitchen looking for a snack, and he opens up the first cabinet and he pulls out some things, right? So he pulls out some dry pasta and a box of rice and some soup mix, right? This isn't really what he was looking for. So he moves over to this drawer and he pulls out a fork and a spoon and this very child-friendly looking knife. And then he moves to the third cabinet, and when he pulls out this pot, right, at this point, he may decide to stop searching in this location and instead move immediately to another location where, for the purposes of this example, he finds what it is that he was looking for. So what he's been able to do here, right, is move beyond his immediate observations of the individual items in each cabinet to draw this more abstract or higher order generalization that cabinets contain items of the same type, right? And this not only saves him some search time, but maybe later on, if his brother comes in looking for a marshmallow, he might be able to direct him to that cabinet where he found the cookies, which we recognize that as a pretty good suggestion, right? And this is all based on this abstract inference that he's just been able to make. So this is a very everyday example, but examples like this one really suggest that this low-level object-based information and these more abstract relational concepts are probably appearing more or less in tandem with one another, right? The child is learning both sets of information at the same time. And this makes sense because a critical feature of human cognition is our ability to reason beyond the limits of our direct experiences. So from a very small number of specific instances, we can make general inferences about the characteristics of our environment. Those in turn support learning and guide our behavior in the world. Despite this, though, these concrete to abstract models are intuitive, and therefore they persist. And I think part of the reason for this is that in some contexts, children are just really, really bad at looking beyond salient perceptual cues in their environment in order to infer these abstract relationships that exist between objects and events. So one example of this has gotten a lot of attention is children's failure to infer the relational concept same and different. So these concepts serve as a case study for a much more general phenomenon. And that's because they can't be defined. They're some of the most basic concepts that can't be defined in terms of their perceptual properties alone, right? So if you take a look at the sample here, the fact that those squares are yellow and the fact that they're squares, right, isn't really the thing that allows us to match it, right, as adults with this other relational match. It's the fact that these two things are in this shared same relationship. But despite that, even in a basic matching task like this one, preschool-age children have a very strong preference in the opposite direction. So when given an opportunity to match the sample to an object in common, they will overwhelmingly, without some pretty heavy-handed interventions, go with the object match here. And actually, even in a case like this one, when there's no object match available, now preschoolers are responding at chance between these two. So historically, this type of evidence has been interpreted to mean that these kinds of abstract concepts, even the most basic ones like same and different, are just not available to young children. And these kinds of studies have also been done to look across species as well. So in graduate school, I thought this was unlikely. It seemed to be inconsistent with everything I believed to be true about early learning. So I set out to disprove this, and as a warning to graduate students in the room, this led me down a really deep rabbit hole that I'm still in today. And I've been at my job for 10 years, so be careful what you study now, because it does follow you. Or it can. You want it to, right? You want it to follow you. Okay, so what I did was I developed a task for toddlers with my old PhD advisor, Alison Gopnik. These are little kids, 1.5 to 2.5 years old, so just toddlers. And it really, the intention was to move away from this land of abstract two-dimensional shapes and instead present children with a causal learning problem that requires that they infer the concepts and then use them to produce some exciting outcome in the world. So to do this, we just replaced the typical abstract materials with what we call a Blickett detector, which is just a flexible causal system that we tend to use in developmental psychology to study causal inferences in kids. It's basically a box that lights up or plays music when certain things are placed on top. So the things put on top are the cause, whatever it produces is the effect, and it's flexible, so you can use it to study children's inferences. Children find this quite rewarding.
Music. Let's try again.
Okay. So we can use this for a whole bunch of things, but in contrast to the previous studies of causal inference using this device, here the causal relationship was about this abstract relation, same or different, between the two objects, as opposed to what's usually used here, which is something like color or shape of the individual objects themselves. So there were two conditions in this initial study, one for same and one for different. Here's the design for the same condition. Children saw 4 pairs of objects being placed on this toy. The 2 that activated the toy were in the same relation, and then the 2 in the different relation were inert. At test, they were given 2 novel pairs that they hadn't seen before. There's no object match here. And they just had to choose the same pair in order to get this right. We also had a different condition, which is here, and a nice feature of this experiment and all of these experiments is that we used all the same training and test trials. We just reversed the pattern of activation. So now the different pairs are the ones that are causal, and the same pairs are inert, same test pairs, but now the reverse test pair is correct. So they sort of serve as controls for one another. And toddlers did extremely well with this. So they learned both same and different relational concepts in a causal version of this task. These results have been replicated repeatedly, but it was also replicated almost identically a couple years later in the subsequent paper. But, as I pointed out previously, these results really fly in the face of decades of research suggesting that children should not be able to succeed on these same different tasks in an active behavioral version of a task. So there was some evidence that babies can do this in looking time paradigms, but in these more explicit behavioral tasks, children had notoriously failed. So we thought that it was the causal context that allowed children to succeed on this task. We figured kids are used to reasoning about causal relationships. Those are relations. So if we put this abstract relation in this context, perhaps that'll scaffold their reasoning. So we decided to give the same task to these older children that traditionally fail these tasks, and we expected them to succeed as well. And to our surprise, unlike toddlers, these older children just utterly failed to infer the abstract relation in the exact same task. So the second finding is actually quite consistent with the decades of work suggesting that preschool-age children fail. So at the end of this second paper, we proposed the presence of a U-shaped developmental trajectory. Developmental psychologists love U-shaped developmental trajectories because they're pretty rare, and they suggest that something more interesting is going on than just sort of slow and gradual improvement over time. So the idea was that these young kids, 1.5, are succeeding at inferring these relational concepts, and then they temporarily fail around preschool age before going on to ultimately succeed. And we have data with older children on this task now suggesting that that is what happens. But of course, this proposal leaves open a whole variety of challenges and questions, both about the initial peak and also about the subsequent dip that we observe in performance. So first, are toddlers really demonstrating an abstract understanding of same and different when they're responding in this task? And then second, if they are, what's going on with the older kids, right? We still have to explain this. So I'm going to return to this second question in a little bit. To foreshadow, I think the answer is that something totally rational is going on, where children have learned something about the features of the environment that are most likely to be informative to them and most likely to have explanatory power, and that learning is potentially getting in the way of their success on a task like this. But in order to make that case, I think it's important to first establish that there's actually a phenomenon to explain here. So in the rest of this first section, I'm going to start with this first question and provide you with some more evidence of early competence in abstract reasoning in toddlers and somewhat older children as well. So one question that you may have is how abstract these early concepts are, right? So you could imagine a pretty narrow interpretation of same, something like same color and same shape blocks. That wouldn't necessarily generalize across additional instances of the concept same, which is of course the feature of relations that make them so powerful to begin with. And so what we did was to try to test this as we ran a whole series of studies really trying to push the boundaries on children's ability to generalize these abstract relationships across modalities. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. So in one of these studies we assessed, there was 100 toddlers. We assessed whether they would generalize same from visual properties like shape and color to to other kinds of properties like category labels in this case. So to do this, we gave them the same training trials, and then we paired it with test trials where there were two sets of identical objects, so they look exactly the same, and the experimenter went through and labeled each object one at a time, and what the child heard was that one of the pairs were composed of two things with the same label, and the other pair was composed of things with two different labels. These were just novel words. And what we found is that children had no trouble generalizing the same relation in this case. So in addition to showing that children can generalize this abstract concept across modalities, this also provides evidence against the possibility that what children are doing is just matching according to some low-level perceptual cues. So you might imagine that children are just learning something like low perceptual variance or greater symmetry or lower complexity or something is the thing that causes these things to activate the toy, and then just searched for that, right, during the test, in the test pairs. Here, because the test pairs are matched on perceptual similarity, it sort of rules out this idea. But we were a little concerned, and perhaps you are too, about one alternative explanation for these results, which is that children could be learning something like the identity relation. So instead of same, they might be learning identical, in which case, right, you would expect that they would also share the same label in common. So we had to run another 100 toddlers, which I wasn't super happy about. And it literally took us until now, for a bunch of reasons, to finish this study, including COVID, of course. And so we broke the identity relation. So now at test, they still can't rely on visual features to solve this, right, because they're all different. And here, again, children had no trouble generalizing the relationship. Another question you might have is about whether these toddlers are in fact simultaneously learning and applying these higher order rules at the same time as these lower order concrete properties, similar to the kitchen example, right, that I gave you earlier. So this is a project I ran with Marielle Gadou. At the time that we ran this project, she was a psychology postdoc. She is now a first-year graduate student in philosophy at Stanford, so she started over, which I think is cool. So at the time that we created this project, what we did was we gave children a completely ambiguous set of these training trials. So they saw these 4 instances, 2 of which caused the machine to activate, but you might notice that there's 2 perfectly reasonable rules to explain the causal relationship here. What is one rule?
Blue square.
Blue square, very good. And what's the other rule? Different, yeah. Usually people say different first because I've been priming you to think about relations, but you're like right there on the object, on the object concept. So there's nothing wrong with either, right? They're both consistent with the evidence that they observe. Then we divided children, randomly assigned them into 2 conditions. Half of the children got this test pair, so in order to get this correct, they had to infer different from the training trials, and the other half got this pair of objects with that blue square sort of appearing as the correct choice, and then one of the other items that was associated with the effect, right, but the incorrect choice. So half of the kids got this one and the other half would get this one. And again, we found that children were extremely good, around the same as in the previous study on relations, and also extremely good on the object version of this. We did this within subjects too, which I thought was totally unreasonable to do with toddlers, but a reviewer asked us to do it, and they can do this too. So if we give them 2 training trials without, 2 test trials without feedback, so we show them the one training, and then they see this pair and they pick, and then they see this pair and they pick. Performance is lower, so it's not as high as 80%. It's closer to 71%, but it's still significantly above chance. So children are able to do this in both contexts. So I really like this finding. I feel like it provides evidence, right, not only for children's ability to simultaneously infer hypotheses at multiple levels of abstraction, but also to hold multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously and then flexibly apply them depending on what the needs of the learning context are, right, what they're actually asked to do with the information at test. And in fact, my lab has some brand new findings that children will actually explore a similar set of objects differently, like they'll take different actions on those objects depending on whether their learning goal requires a concrete or abstract rule. So they do seem to explore these objects differently, again, depending on their goal. And given that all of these findings occur in the context of variations on the same paradigm, I also wanted to highlight some different kinds of tests that we've used to show the similar kind of competence in these young children. So these studies were conducted by my previous graduate student, Liz Lapidow, who has abandoned me to be a postdoc at University of Waterloo. So here we show 2 and 3-year-olds, these two identical opaque containers. Children observed as the experimenter drew objects apparently at random from each container and placed the samples into these transparent boxes in front of the container. She then held up this card showing a novel colored ball that the children hadn't seen sampled from either container and just asked, which one do you think contains the green ball? And children got to pick one of the containers to search inside. So adults have a really strong intuition here, right? That you should choose the varied sample container as opposed to the uniform one. But this isn't necessarily true, right? There's no green objects in either sample. So the first order information can't inform you which of these two containers is actually the better choice. You have this intuition because what you're doing is drawing the second order inference, right? You're thinking about the difference in their variability, and then you're using that to infer that the balls in one box are uniform and the balls in the other box are variable and therefore are more likely to contain something that's new. And children have this intuition as well. So these are 2 and 3-year-olds. In fact, we show the same pattern of competence in a series of causal reasoning tasks that have that same logic. So in this task, we introduce children to this bird feeder device, and they find out that when you push buttons, different things happen. So every time you push the blue button, these blue food pellets come out of this first tube, and every time you push the yellow button, these yellow food pellets come out of a variety of tubes. Notably, neither button produces food pellets in that third tube. And of course, when the bird returns, the bird wants to eat from the third tube, and we ask children, which button do you think we should push in order to produce food in this third tube? So it has the same logic as the sampling task in a causal context. And again, children have no trouble reasoning about this task as well. So each of these studies suggests that very young children have this powerful ability to identify abstract characteristics of problems that they're confronted with in the world, and then use that information to narrow the space of possibilities that they consider, even when they're making novel predictions about something that they haven't observed previously. So, do toddlers really have abstract relational concepts? I think that they do. So in contrast with the conventional wisdom, these abstract concepts are available to young children. They are not solely rooted in perceptual experience. They are abstract, they are flexible, and they can facilitate a variety of different predictions about the world. And establishing this, of course, allows us to return to this second question, which is why are older children failing? So I'm going to pause for a minute and give you guys a chance to ask questions. Yeah.
Are these single trial tests? Or do you take multiple repeats?
Yeah, so it depends on, so all of those Blicket detector tests are all single trial. Well, except for the one that I showed you where we gave them those 2 test trials. And that's because when you give toddlers more than one trial, they perform well on the first trial, and then they do something exploratory on the second trial and subsequent trials. So we saw this repeatedly because it feels better to have multiple trials. So we did try to do it with multiple trials, but we found that basically children were exploring to find out what would happen if they chose the other one. So we stuck with a single trial paradigm. Yeah.
I was wondering, so like when you could do the green square, or you could do the objects that are different.
Mm-hmm.
Do they get both relationships, or if they get an answer that has one, does that collapse it down so they stop considering the other one as being the meaningful relation?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if we were to give them feedback that one of those is actually correct, then presumably they would abandon the incorrect, right, hypothesis. So all of this is based on this notion that children are updating, right? So they're kind of updating the hypothesis that they have in mind. At the point at which we show them this evidence, the evidence is ambiguous and consistent with at least 2 hypotheses, and those are the 2 that we're probing at test. If we rule one of those out, presumably children should be able to update and stick with just the one. Yeah. We haven't tried that. It's actually it's a good idea. Yeah. Any other questions about the first studies? You're just buying all this? Little kids can do abstract reasoning? Fantastic. Most of you aren't developmentalists, right? Raise your hand if you are not a developmentalist. Oh, so I don't even really have to convince you. You just like, it seems logical to you, right? That children should be able to do this. Okay, so so why are older children failing? So to sort of foreshadow what I'm going to argue, I've argued that children's early competence is overshadowed by a learned bias to privilege object-based objects and their properties. And if it's learned, then it makes sense that this bias should be stronger in older children who've had more experience and time to learn the bias in the world. Now, to be clear, many people have proposed that children's failure on abstract reasoning tasks is due to their focus on objects and object properties. This is what decades of research on what's called the relational shift is all about. So people like Dedry Gentner, who studies analogical reasoning, and her colleagues. But critically, all of that previous work has proposed that children start with objects, they start with concrete concepts, then over time, with experience, usually also with language, they develop these abstract relational concepts down the road. So in other words, they've claimed what most people claim, which is that knowing more aids learning, right, which is intuitive. What we've proposed is the opposite. We're proposing that knowing more actually winds up leading to this bias that gets in the way of children's performance on these abstract reasoning tasks, at least temporarily. So that brings us to the second part of the talk, where I'm going to kind of follow this same thread to consider what constrains the possibilities that are privileged, and more specifically, what are the conditions under which the abstract hypotheses or possibilities become available, and does the learning context play a role here? So I'm going to begin this section with highlighting some cross-cultural work that I've been doing with my postdoc, Alex Carsonson. She has also abandoned me, so she's now faculty at Arizona State University. You get really happy for these people, but then you miss them also. It's sad. So here we examined what we're calling constraints in the global learning context, and by that we just mean the world. We mean things like language and culture. And in particular, we were considering a bunch of previous proposals that had argued that the object bias, so the focus on objects and its properties, may be partly driven or at least encouraged by patterns of language learning or other kinds of cultural factors. And so it's been suggested, first, that an emphasis on nouns, which forms the bulk of children's vocabulary in early life, may be focusing their attention on objects, right? And that's because nouns refer to concrete individual entities and their properties in the world. On the other hand, right, verbs tend to emphasize the relational meanings across multiple objects or subjects. And so you might expect that this would boost relative attention, right, to these abstract relationships instead. Conveniently, this focus on nouns is not universal across languages. So we know from Twyla Tardif's work that children who are learning Mandarin Chinese do not show as pronounced a noun bias as children learning English. So there's still a noun bias there, but it's not as pronounced. And so this cross-linguistic difference presented these two natural conditions in word learning that we could then exploit as a test of this hypothesis that relatively fewer nouns may de-emphasize this object bias in these children. I should note, this is, for those of you who study language, this is a really coarse measure of an object bias, right? We're looking at nouns generally. It could be rooted in production of nouns, comprehension of nouns, other things like pronoun dropping, and other things that languagey people like to think about, but I don't. So for these purposes, we're just going to group those all together and call it noun bias. And of course, right, you might be thinking that there are other environmental factors that differ between these two contexts that are also likely to play a role. And in particular, a focus on relations is also going to be predicted by what's called a collectivist context, like the one in rice-growing regions of China, which is where we collected these data, which emphasize the relationships among members of a group rather than this individual or entity focus that we tend to observe here in the US. This is something that has been studied extensively, and it's been proposed actually to play a role in the differences that we observe in abstract reasoning between Eastern and Western cultures, including some work that Amtal is doing. Yes. Okay, so after surveying the literature a little bit, we started to think about this in terms of a continuum, not so much from collectivism to an entity sort of theory, but in terms of context sensitivity. So relatively more attention to contextual factors rather than the things in the foreground. And critically, regardless, right, of what features of language or what features of culture is really the culprit here, English-speaking children being raised in the US are doubly disadvantaged on both of these accounts, right? So they both point to focusing on objects, whereas Mandarin learners growing up in China are doubly advantaged, right? Both on the language and the culture accounts. So to test this, we just replicated that original paradigm in both cultures with preschoolers. So remember, in the US, preschoolers are failing on this task. So we were curious if Chinese preschoolers would fail as well. and we find no evidence for failure in Chinese-speaking 3-year-olds. So in a second experiment, we're like, okay, let's start at 18 months and look at the entire window, the 1.5-year window between 18 months when we see success in the US and 3 when we see this difference between these cultures. And the data really clearly establish these 2 distinct developmental trajectories of relational reasoning across these cultures. So the red line is China. You see basically a linear trajectory where they start off succeeding and they continue to succeed. And you can compare that with the US, where they start off succeeding and then their performance drops substantially by the time they're 3. And we think of this, of course, as eventually going up, although those data aren't graphed here. So then we were interested in how children in China might respond to this ambiguous case where there's 2 possible rules, right, defining the causal system. So to remind you, there's the blue square, and there's also different, and they're both reasonable. So these are totally ambiguous data. The idea was now, unlike the previous study, we actually forced children to decide between the 2 by making these new test pairs. So we took the 2 blue squares and brought them together to create what we called an object match, which is correct with respect to the object hypothesis, but incorrect with respect to the relational hypothesis, which should be different. And then we took the other 2 objects that were associated with the effect, and those came together to create the relational match, which is correct with respect to the relation different, but incorrect with respect to the object blue square. Everyone's following? Okay. And so we figured, if children in China are less biased by objects and their properties, perhaps they'll be more likely to overcome an object bias that we expected to see in children in the US based on prior work, and instead go with a relational match in an ambiguous context. And that is what we saw. So these are the results. They're really pretty results, right? So you see that the object match is in yellow, so the US kids, as predicted, are privileging the object match when it's pit against the relational match, and we see a reverse in China, where the relational match is being chosen over the object match. So we concluded from this together that there are these naturally occurring population-level differences in object and relational focus. They appear early in development, and they lead to qualitative differences in the trajectory of relational reasoning in children in each of these contexts. Now, isolating the effects of linguistic and other cultural factors is challenging work, and it's also not really my area of expertise, but I got this NSF award, and we said we would do it. And so, along with Alex, who is an expert in this, and many colleagues around the world, we are currently trying to find out, look at some context that we anticipate will vary along each of these 2 dimensions in order to sort out which of this type of input is more relevant in leading to this object bias. So we are currently conducting data collection in Mexico, which is quite convenient for us because we're on the border. We're in San Diego. We're going to South Korea and also Turkey, because I have a graduate student from Turkey, so that was a convenient sample. But it also happens to be quite interesting because they tend to be more verb focused, so more like Mandarin Chinese than like English or Spanish. We just finished data collection actually in South Korea, so I thought it would be fun to show you some of these data. So South Korea is really interesting. So perhaps surprisingly, if you're not familiar with this literature, it actually shares a noun bias with English. So Mike Frank at Stanford has this work that just a few years ago, I think, showed that actually, unlike Mandarin Chinese, Korean shares a noun bias with English. And then presumably they're more sort of collectivist or context sensitive, or at least more so, right, than their US counterparts to those in China. So we really like this example as a way to maybe pull apart these 2 theories. So what you see here is Korea is now plotted in black. China, we don't have 4-year-old data, which is why it stops there, but China is in red, and then the US data appears in blue. And it seems like we've provided evidence for maybe a third intermediate trajectory. So the first thing to point out is that toddlers across all contexts succeed. So they're all performing above chance. But you'll also notice that the Korean toddlers and the Chinese toddlers actually look more similar to one another. And this is because of something I didn't mention earlier. In the US, kids are performing equally well on same and different, which is quite high in both contexts. In both of these cultures, actually, children are performing better on same than different. So they seem to have, it's easier for them to reason about same relations than different relations, and they share that between these 2 cultural contexts. Then if you look at preschool age, right, it suggests that 3-year-olds in the Korean sample certainly look a lot more like US 3-year-olds in terms of the dip, but they also seem to recover a little bit earlier. So we're still trying to make sense of these data, but it suggests that maybe variations in both linguistic and other forms of cultural input beyond language contribute, right, to these distinct trajectories that we're observing, and they may do so at different time points, right, over the course of development. So in ongoing work, we're exploring potential moderating factors, or what exactly is it that's doing the work here, and I'm happy to discuss that in Q&A if you're curious, but I'll skip it for now. So just to summarize what I've covered so far, right? Children appear to have and retain relational concepts from an early age, but the nature of their prior experience leads them to privilege certain possibilities or hypotheses over others. And this is a good strategy, right? Because when we're coming up with possible explanations for our observations in the world, it's usually the case that it's going to be consistent with at least two, but more likely a vast array of potential solutions. So in order to constrain the possibility space, we really have to rely on these learned biases, right? These general principles that have proven to have explanatory power in the past for a particular learning problem. But that also means that if we give children the right input, they should be able to override these tendencies. So the sort of flip side of this second part is exploring how we can manipulate other forms of input besides just language and cultural input in the immediate learning environment to facilitate abstract reasoning in older children who usually fail in the US. So I can pause here for cross-cultural questions if anyone has them. Yeah.
Are all the children in the sample monolingual or some bilingual or bilingual?
That's a good question. So we did only monolingual children for all of the studies that you've seen so far. Once we were aware of the cross-cultural difference that we got, a lot of people suggest that we should be running bilinguals to try to pull these things apart. And I have been told that bilingualism is sort of its own category, and so we haven't yet decided to recruit bilinguals. So you can imagine recruiting English Mandarin bilinguals living in the US and in China. We have a tiny set of data that's part of another project looking at this, and they do actually look kind of interesting, so I think probably we'll wind up pursuing this as well. Yeah, it's a good question. Other questions about this? Yeah.
Feel free to pump this later.
Okay.
I'm just curious, what do you think is the difference between the same concept versus a different concept and how do we think the cross-cultural differences?
Yeah. What do you think is the difference between same and different? I don't know the answer. You mean specifically that would lead to the, it's hot in here, or maybe it's just me because I'm presenting and I'm hot. I can't totally explain that, but if you have ideas from a cultural psych perspective, I'd be super curious.
I was wondering whether it's anything to do with bottom-up construction of the category based on the same relationship. If you just have something to anchor on to with a repetition of either a perceptual feature or some other feature that repeats across category members, whether that allows those categories to be construct compared to something like, I don't know. My immediate intuition, I just started thinking about this when you showed the results.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if different in some way, maybe more abstract, or something like that.
Yeah, so Susan Carey says this. So she has some work arguing that same is a primitive concept, that basically we're born with it and that we share it with other species. And that different doesn't come online till later once you have relational language, is what she argues. You need the word for different in order to represent different. And if you succeed on different, what you're really doing is saying not same. So that's her argument, is that what we have is same plus negation. And that hurts my head because every time I've tried to design studies that would differentiate between different and same plus negation, I wind up back where I started. There's got to be a way to do this. I just haven't come up with a way. We do have, so that evidence I showed you earlier with the little kids sort of learning uniformity and avoiding it does actually seem consistent with Susan's claim. Yeah, you just raised your hand.
If you have three things.
Yeah, tell me.
If you have three things, if they're all different,
yeah.
It's not the same as.
Oh, right, three things. Why aren't we doing three things? You mean three test pairs, right?
No. It takes 3 items to activate the rest.
3 items. So you would have
Say one
same.
different, three still all different? Right?
Like, not the same is not the same. Meaning.
You're talking about graded representations of difference. So a little bit different and, right.
2 is the same as 1 is different, it's not the same.
Right.
But it's not.
Yes. So we ran something like that, not in this task, but I wonder if I have an extra slide for this. I thought I did. Hold on one second. This, yes, this. So we ran this as a follow-up study. It's not exactly what you're asking, but it's similar, as a follow-up study to that sampling task, where we wanted to know we wanted to know whether children were basically learning uniformity and avoiding it, or really learning something like variability. Both are abstract concepts, so I have no problem with either approach. But what we found was that 2- and 3-year-olds could only succeed on the version I showed you before, which was all same versus all different. It wasn't until 4 that they were able to succeed on this difference here, which is more versus less varied. Now these are small samples. I talked about this with Michelle this morning. I don't exactly know what would happen if we sort of increase the size. I think there's a lot of things that we can do, but it certainly seems consistent with the claim that uniformity and therefore same is easier. Although I didn't believe it at first. Yeah.
So how are you defining same and different?
Yeah, all same. Well, it depends on the study. So this one here is basically all in terms of variability, right? So more versus less variable, so there is no same. Anytime we've used same in a study, it's been identity relation, except for the generalization task, where we have a couple of studies I didn't talk about where there's shape and color, and they learn same shape, and color is irrelevant, and then at test they can apply it to same color when shape is irrelevant. So we can get them to sort of swap the relevant dimension that they're paying attention to. So there, it's same along a single dimension.
And do you get the shape bias emerging at some point?
So we thought we might, but we don't. Not using these stimuli. So we have So we don't see any relative advantage going in one direction over the other.
So in terms of same, it's like token same.
In that case, yes.
So if you had same type differing in size, for example, something like that, like how much does it have to be different along which dimensions in order to actually count as different?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. So I think it probably depends on the training, right? So I could imagine training kids to pay attention to any dimension regardless of what it was, but it would require some training, right, to get them to pay attention to one over the other. I don't think that the identity relation is privileged probably, right? So same, like identical same seems to be the most foundational concept. I think anytime you're going to change one of the other dimensions, you're going to introduce some difficulty and some noise. There is some work looking at perceptual entropy, and so the idea of like, it seems like humans, so this is work looking across species, so other animals seem to be paying attention to a continuous dimension of same and different, whereas humans treat them categorically. So if there's one thing that's different, that violates the category same, and now it's different, whereas non-human primates don't do that. So they'll sort of treat one different as in the same category as all same. So there seems to be a distinction made between the category approach and a more continuous approach, something like this. Yeah.
I'm not sure this belongs at this point in the talk, but I'm wondering if there's, because you're talking about a collectivist, not collectivist, noun, not noun. I'm wondering if there's something else that's different than either of those that's part of the environment. That if you measured adults, if you give them a random array of stuff and said, what are the relationships in this random array, that they would be different between, say, your U.S. and Mexico samples and your China sample. You know, something like that, where this is somehow or other getting to the the preschool kids as well. What are my adults around me paying attention to?
Yeah.
What relationships are they pulling out of the environment?
Yeah, so we are doing that. We're doing stuff like that, which is, I have a slide for that too. Bam. Okay, so we're doing a bunch of cross-cultural tasks, but like the one that works the best is this one. So it's one of these picture tasks where you have kids and adults in both cultures describe what they see in the picture. And what you see is that, for example, adults in the US will say there's a cat. And then if you probe them, they'll say the cat's standing on the stairs. Whereas in China, they'll say there's stairs and they're made out of rock and there's a cat, right? And so it seems like attention to certain foreground versus background is something that differs across contexts. And so this is one of the things that we're sort of exploring to see whether this relates at all to children's abstract reasoning performance, along with a bunch of other stuff. So there's a lot of cultural psychology work out there, some of which is good and some of which is not so good, showing things like social, sort of how you attribute traits to an individual or to the environment, uniqueness preferences and visual attention are all kinds of things that might matter for this. So we would lump those all as culture, right? So not so much collectivism, but context.
You could, if you could get the parents in as well, and test them with their kids.
Yeah, to see what they're talking about.
Instead of this general culture, you say, what's their microculture?
Yeah. Yeah. So our collaborator in Korea is doing stuff like that, where she's doing parent-child sort of interaction conversations with these storybooks to see how parents read to their kids, and then doing these relational reasoning tasks. And she does see individual differences in how parents talk about these things. Maybe or maybe not. It's too early to tell whether they relate to children's relational reasoning. Yeah. Yes?
So you're only so far
Yeah.
talking about shape,
Yeah.
color,
Yeah.
in terms of sameness, identity. But there are, and I thought you were going to go, these are privileged images. So there are other things, weight, the amount of time between
Yeah.
things. And so do you think that some of these features, and you're sort of assuming some kind of feature space, are privileged over others? So same in terms of sort of occurring at the same time
Yeah.
versus occurring separately. Something that weighs in, something that has a different texture than something else. Because it does seem like you're going to falling back on those same things.
Yeah.
At least from my whole 25 years ago, reading of developmental psychology, people are always talking about the same six.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Part of our goal in this whole series of studies was to talk about the old findings. So like there's just been this long-term belief that children progress along a universal trajectory on these kinds of items. And so part of the goal was to use the gold standard, which is shape and color, to show that we can push those around. And I'll show you some more studies now where we push these around. But I agree with you. So we need to move sort of beyond just these particular dimensions to see how far this goes. So one thing that I'll talk about in a little while is how we're extending this to think about causal structures. So things like feedback loops or causal chains, or sort of thinking about the underlying mechanism of a particular system and seeing whether children can sort of spontaneously infer similarity there as well. So I could talk for a long time. So I'll sort of show you what those stimuli look like in a little bit. But I agree with you. Yeah. Developmental psychologists get really attached to tasks. We're like really task heavy.
Well, one thing, I mean, if you think of games that children play,
Yeah.
and that are designed for children, like the game sets.
Mhm.
where you can
I love
have
sets.
number,
Yeah.
color,
Yeah.
text,
Yeah. You're right. Yeah.
And they're not, if I remember right, at least some of the shapes don't have, at least in English, clear names.
Mhm.
Like they're not supposed to.
Yeah, like the wiggly line or whatever. Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
they are. I mean, those probably are dimensions that children pay attention to. So one of the things I was surprised didn't include in whose my impression of what development is so interesting is number.
Yeah, so people have looked at this, have done these kinds of tasks using numbers. So one of my colleagues, Dave Barner, who studies number cognition, is using these kinds of tasks to study whether or not children are sensitive to same number. They're not so good at it. You have tasks like this too, right? Is the upshot that kids aren't so good at this? At this age, at under 3?
I don't have strong data.
Okay. His data suggests that you sort of surprising how children are not sort of spontaneously using number when they're matching these things. They need a little bit of additional prompting.
They're really, really bad. They're really bad even after they're okay with like counting. They're pretty bad at paying attention to number.
As like one of these abstract features that they should be sorting things according, but they can learn, presumably. You can teach them to do this. Yeah.
If you tell them explicitly this is a number, then
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go on. Is everyone okay with that? Okay. We've been sitting for a while. Do you guys need to like wiggle for a minute? Feel free. Okay. So, like I said, what we're doing now is I'm going to show you some studies where the goal was, okay, what if we don't have language and culture, we just manipulate features of the learning environment? So the first, most dumb thing that we did, that was the fastest study that I've ever published in my life and got published in Psych Science, and I still don't really understand why, because I think there's a lot of open questions here. We just took the Blicket detector task and we glued some transparent openings to either side of the Blicket detector. So this work was based on, do you guys know who John Norman is? He wrote a book called The Design of Everyday Things. He's in the cognitive science department at UCSD, so we were inspired by that really brilliant book to see, hey, maybe we could do this really subtle design cue that would get children thinking about other relevant rules that may dictate the system. So we put these transparent openings, and instead of placing the objects on top, we had a control group where we placed objects on top, and then this group where we put objects. They watched the experimenter insert objects into either side of the device, and this really subtle cue heightened 3-year-olds' tendency to engage in relational reasoning, and now they're succeeding in both same and different, with a significant difference between this condition and the basic condition. You could ask me why this works, and I don't really know why this works. I'm not totally sure what the mechanism is. You might imagine that like having the opening sort of draws their attention to the fact that there's two things, and perhaps they're considering what the relationship between those things are, but we didn't test that, and so if people have ideas about what's going on, it was relatively simple to change children's reasoning using a paradigm like this. In another project, my grad student, Eric Brockbank, who also left me, he's now a postdoc at Stanford, we've been studying how prompting children to explain can also lead them to privilege abstract solutions. We're thinking of this as providing a sort of internal context. So if language and culture and design is an external context, if I prompt you to explain, maybe that's providing a sort of internal context for you. This is based on a lot of my own prior work, as well as work from Tanya Lombroso, who's one of my PhD advisors, and people like Mickey Chi, who have pointed out that explaining prompts children to look for broad generalizations or regularities in the data that they observe. And so the idea was, okay, if explanation prompts generalization, maybe that would be a really good tool for getting them to reason relationally on these standard tasks. So to test this, we brought the old two-dimensional shapes back, and we work with older kids because this is a much more challenging task. And what we did here was to demonstrate for children how to sort the cards. So the experimenter said, okay, in my game, this one goes with this one, and she moved the card next to the target. And then the difference between conditions was that half of the children were asked to explain, why did I put this one with this one in my game? And then the other half were just asked, which one did I put with this one in my game? So the goal of the control was to draw their attention to the match, but not to engage them in any kind of explanatory process. After demonstrating, the child got a turn with a new set of 3 items, and then they alternated. So it was experimenter demonstrating, followed by children's turn, back and forth for 12 trials. So children got 6 opportunities to generate explanations and 6 opportunities to generate their own matches. And what we found was a really substantial impact on children's relational matching behavior in the explanation condition. So explaining overwhelmingly led them to prioritize relational matches, whereas kids in the control are performing the way kids typically control or perform at this age, which is the object match is quite salient to them, and so they're overwhelmingly going with this. In order to try to better understand the mechanisms underlying these effects, Eric and I extended this work into adults because when I talk about the fact that explaining and also other sorts of input are constraining the possibilities that children consider, I'm really confounding at least two possible mechanisms here. So the prompts may impact the process of generating possible hypotheses by sort of shaping what comes to mind in the first place, which is how I usually think about this. But it could also be that it impacts learners' evaluation of possibilities at some point further downstream. So we can't know for sure based on the evidence we've already generated. So we designed a task specifically to try to pull these things apart to understand what explanation is doing in order to lead to this sort of abstraction. So to do this, we presented adults in 2 conditions with a rule learning task. So participants were shown a series of what we called fishing lures. They were just shapes stacked on top of each other. And then they saw which lure combinations caught a fish, and they saw them one at a time. Participants in the explain condition for each one were prompted to explain why they thought that particular lure caught a fish. And in the control condition, they were just asked what happened. So to describe what happened or just describe the lure combination that produced that particular outcome. In case you're interested, the correct rule was an abstract rule. So this is following in previous work done on explanation. It was that pointy shapes on the bottom. So regardless of what the shape was, it could be triangle, diamond, what have you. As long as it was pointy, it was associated with catching a fish. So we already knew or thought that explanation would support learning the abstraction because we know that explanation supports broad generalization and abstraction. What we wanted to know was how it does that. So at test, participants got 3 types of questions, 2 that we considered hypothesis generation questions, one where they had to generate the rule in a free response, and one where they had to classify a bunch of new items that they hadn't seen before. And then one evaluation task where they were given possible rules one at a time, and they were asked to evaluate the goodness of each of those rules in turn. And what we found was that explainers generated the rule in a free response more often. Their mean classification accuracy was higher, but there was no difference in their mean evaluation rating. So they were just as good at evaluating each of these rules. And so this suggests that explaining and maybe other types of input in the environment as well winds up constraining reasoning by changing the space of possibilities that are considered in the first place, at least in adults and at least in this task. Lots of caveats, but it's sort of suggestive. So it appears then that the tendency to privilege concrete over abstract features is learned, it is context dependent, it's surprisingly malleable, so lots of different ways to get children to do this. And this is good, right? Because the capacity to engage in abstract reasoning is not only central to the basic processes underlying learning, but it also supports our acquisition of domain-specific content. So concepts like waves, opposites, patterns, themes of a story, right? And it also supports domain general capacities, things like knowledge transfer and creativity, which also depend on recognizing shared abstract structure between seemingly unrelated events in the world. And so something that this career award allows me to do is to work on educational applications of this project. So we're currently applying these insights to create learning environments to better support abstraction in the biological world. So my grad student Alex and I are partnering with museum practitioners at Birch Aquarium, which is on campus at UCSD, to help them design exhibits and also educational programming to try to increase children and adults' interest and ability to reason about abstract biological properties. With my postdoc, Jamie Amemia, who's now an assistant professor at Occidental College, we've also been extending the work to the social domain to examine what kind of contexts support reasoning about more abstract structural factors over these individual or intrinsic factors when people are reasoning about causes of inequality in the world. So structural causes are the sort of more abstract cause, and so we're seeing whether or not we can change the way that people are thinking about this to highlight these more structural causes. Okay, to return to the second question here, does the learning context constrain the possibilities that are privileged? Again, the answer seems to be yes. The last section is only 5 minutes or less, but I want to pause here in case anybody has questions about this section. Or if you want to stand up. No questions? No standing. Okay, fine. Okay, so in the final part, I'm really going to break from this work on abstraction to talk very briefly about some additional work that we're doing exploring what children do when they're confronted with uncertainty. So these are instances where the environmental input, whatever it is not sufficient to constrain their reasoning, and they're left with multiple possibilities to navigate. So that's the idea here. And in particular, we're exploring the degree to which children are aware that there are multiple alternatives present for a particular phenomenon. Because in the literature, there seems to be this disconnect between children's intuitive recognition of uncertainty in the world and then their ability to explicitly acknowledge that there's more than one possibility that's present, both in their actions and also in their explicit judgments. So I'm going to provide 2 quick examples for how we're looking at this and how we're thinking about this. So first, we know that children seek more information when they're confronted with multiple possible explanations for how the world works. These are a few publications from my own lab making this point, but lots of people have made this point, including Jenny, right? You've made this point. Children will direct their exploration and their learning towards instances where there's some uncertainty. Liz and I have shown that when preschoolers observe some outcome, like the wilted flowers in this example, and they're tasked with determining which of these 2 possible explanations is correct, they will consistently act on the most informative variable. So in this case, the most informative variable is B, which is the dry soil. So to make this really concrete, if adding water to your flower changes the status of the wilted flowers, you can infer that this, right, causal structure is correct. If, however, you add water to your flowers and nothing happens to your wilted flowers, this one, right, is the more likely causal structure. And what we find is that children can not only choose the most informative action in these cases, but based on the thing that they observe happening, they can then make the appropriate inference about which of these explanations is correct. On the other hand, children will fail tasks utterly that require that they do basically the same thing, so discriminating between possible causes when they're in the context of a formal experiment. And this is true both in classrooms and also in the laboratory. So there's decades of education research on the development of scientific reasoning showing that even school-age children, even college students, struggle with controlled variables. They struggle to conduct them and they study to reason about them. And so to explain this, Liz's dissertation work has argued that there's just a mismatch that exists between tasks that are used to assess formal experimentation and children's goals as fundamentally causal learners trying to find out something about the world. And specifically that what children are trying to do is to seek causal knowledge that is generalizable, that is stable across contexts, and that they can control, right? So that they can actually enact changes in the world. And so when we make scientific reasoning experiments, allow them to find out this kind of information, we find that children succeed at much earlier. So we're sort of trying to align these two pieces up. Last, we also observe this disconnect in children's metacognitive judgments. So for example, if you introduce children to these three windows, right, of different levels of occlusion and therefore different amounts of certainty or uncertainty, and you ask them, how sure are you that there's a shape like this one behind this window? Children will respond that they are very sure that there's a heart behind the clear window. They are very sure that there's a heart behind the partial window, and they are very sure that there's a heart behind the fully occluded window. So they generally respond with overconfidence. This has sort of been well established. However, if you use exactly the same materials, but you ask them to do something else, you ask them to choose a window to explore to find out more about the shapes inside, now the vast majority of children will correctly direct their exploration to the fully occluded window, and the rest of them will explore the partial window. So this suggests that children are in fact sensitive to what it is that they don't know, and that this sensitivity appears much earlier in the context of their exploration of the world than it does in their explicit metacognitive judgments, and that their decisions that they're making in their self-guided exploration improves their epistemic status about the world, even if they can't report that change in status to you. So one question we had was whether maybe just exploring, bumbling around the world and being wrong in your everyday life when you're a child plays a role for calibrating those explicit judgments about what you know to this intuitive recognition that there's uncertainty in the world. So to check this, we capitalized on the fact that there's like a really reasonable expectation that the heart is behind this partially occluded window. This is what it looks like is behind there. But before we showed them what's behind the window, we asked them for their confidence judgments. And then afterwards, we revealed something unexpected pulled out from that window that violated their beliefs. After having this experience, children were much more likely to rely on the entire scale, not perfectly, but better, when they were making subsequent judgments on future trials. So these results have inspired a whole bunch of ongoing work to explore this link between this intuitive and more explicit recognition of uncertainty in the world. The idea is to assess whether these stem from the same cognitive system at different points in the lifespan. So we're conducting a bunch of cross-sectional and longitudinal studies to try to get at this question. So you can invite me back in like 2 to 3 years. And I'll have a different talk. So to close, learners infer both concrete and abstract concepts from very early on, and features of the learning context impose critical constraints on the possibilities that we consider over the course of development. So thank you for listening.
Do we have time for questions?
Yes. Yes.
So I'm wondering about, this is like a sort of broad question about the distinction, if there is one, between sort of abstraction and relations. So at times you said